Hey everyone, and welcome to this video series on how to contribute to the final project. So today we are going to be talking about components. We're going to be talking about what to think about when you're building a component, and we're going to be talking about how to put your components into Storybook. So I have a final project loaded up here, and you can see when we're talking about components, we're generally talking about the React application that will be on the client side. So we are in the client folder right now. There are two directories here that I want you to keep an eye on, and one of them is the components directory, and the other one is the containers directory. And what's the difference between these two? So the components directory is where we're going to put all of our DOM components, and the container folder is where we're going to put our smart components. I'm not sure which terminology you're most familiar with, but just to make sure that we are talking about the same thing when we're talking about DOM and smart components, let's go to the README file and have a quick look. I actually wrote a pretty good guide about building components in there. So you can see this is just the boilerplate repository, but generally the README file should look the same if you go to your specific final project. This video is made so it should hopefully be used for other final projects than just yours. So if you go to your final project to the README file and you have a look here in the table of contents, there should be guidelines for building components. And if you look at that section, you can see that we have like a table here that will outline the difference between presentational components and container components. So we're just like discussing some of the differences between these components. So presentational components is the same that we quite often will refer to as DOM components. These components they might have some logic in them, but it's like really thin logic. Um, and uh, and generally the business logic resides in the smart components, which are the stateful components. Actually, presentational components can have some state as well, but it will only be like local state. So it will not be like state that is shared with other components. It might be the state of a color of a button that's turned either to red or to green or something like that. And the way we figure out whether it's turned red or green is through something coming through props. And you can see here, so if you have DOM components, they should live in the components folder, and if they're smart, they should live in the containers folder. And that's what I just showed you. What's the goal? What's the purpose of making presentational components? That is to determine what a component is going to look like. So a presentational component is going to have all of the HTML structure, all of the markup, and it probably comes with some CSS as well. That depends how you build your components, but it probably comes with the HTML and the CSS to make sure that the application looks the right way. Whereas the container components, they will make sure that your application will actually work the way that it's supposed to. So container components might have the responsibility of getting data from the server, processing requests, and things like that. So that's all the stuff that takes place behind the scenes. In terms of communication, so if you have a DOM component, generally it's only communicating via props. Um, so let me just skip a little bit ahead here. So down in the bottom, we have something called side effects. And I don't know if you know that term, but in programming, a side effect is generally that if you have a function, actually you can take this term and if you know a little bit about math, then you might know that in math you can have pure functions. So if you have a pure function, that means that whenever you have some inputs to a function and those inputs stay the same, the output will always be the same. And if we apply that to programming, that means if we have some parameters to your function, if the parameters coming into the function are the same, then the output will always be the same. And now you may be thinking, wouldn't that be all functions? Doesn't it work this way? If you put some parameters into a function, then you will always get the same output. Wouldn't that be the case, right? Actually not, because some functions have side effects. So imagine that the function that you have here is a function where the input to that function is maybe the host name and the user and the password to a database, and then inside of your function, you're going to connect to that database and you're going to retrieve some values from that database, and then you're going to return those values from the database, right? But now imagine that some other client has modified the data on the database. That means that the content inside of the database has changed. So the content that you are returning in that function might actually change over time. So that means that this function has a side effect. Once you're connecting to some sort of IO, and that could be a database, it could actually also be some of the APIs inside of the browser. Imagine that you're connecting to the geolocation API in the browser. I don't know if you know, but your browser, especially if it's running on a phone, it can actually get access to the GPS on your phone, and it can provide you with the coordinates for wherever you are at the moment. And those coordinates, they will of course change. Whenever you move around, those coordinates will change. So that means accessing an API, such as the geolocation API in the browser, is considered a side effect. Okay, so now we established we have functions with side effects and we have functions that don't have side effects, right? Um, so when I say that a DOM component can only communicate via props, generally that means that a DOM component should be considered a component without side effects. And that's actually the true way to distinguish between smart and DOM components. DOM components never have side effects. Smart components probably do have side effects. Um, so when a component does not have side effects, that means that it's just receiving all of its data via props. And if someone press a button in the DOM component, then the DOM component is going to communicate that via props as well. In practice, in React, that means that you will have a prop with a function passed into it, and that function will then call a parent component. And probably the parent component is a smart component that's able to then, whenever you press the button on the DOM component, then the smart component will be able to call an API and process the request in whichever way is necessary. So in terms of communication, you can see that DOM components, they only communicate via props. And a smart component it can still communicate via props if you need that, but it can also call an API. Maybe you're manipulating the DOM with refs. You can do all kinds of things in a smart component. There's not really any boundaries in terms of side effects. Now there's a section about markup. So DOM components generally contain all of the markup for the application. Whereas smart components, I would say very often I see smart components with a lot of markup in them. But the ideal, if you can actually make your smart components as thin as possible. So you might, if your smart component is like a component that renders a list of users, right? Then the smart components is going to go to the API or the server and fetch some users, and it's going to get back as an array. And then that smart components is then going to render a list of DOM components. And all of these DOM components are then individual users, right? So you're going to pass each of the users. And in this case, it's fine to maybe have like a UL tag in your smart component or something like that. But try to avoid building like really elaborate layouts inside of your smart components, because the really, really great thing about DOM components is that they're very easy to test. Think about it again. They don't have side effects. So that means whenever you give them inputs, you always get the same outputs, right? So that means that they're easy to test. If you give them an input and you get a different output the next time, that means you must have broken something, right? And the more of the UI that we can put in DOM components, the easier it is to test. And one way to test this is, of course, to test it just by having some sort of automated testing where you can see if the same thing is always coming out. But something that's really useful, especially on a project like this, is actually Storybook. So Storybook is what? What is Storybook? So Storybook is a sandbox interface. So it's a little bit of a playground where you can put your DOM components in and you can play around with them. Storybook is not connected to a database or anything like that. So if you were to try to put smart components into Storybook, you would have to figure out a way to have like a fake database and fake API calls and all kind of stuff like that. We don't want to use our time on that. You can do it, but I think it's considered a malpractice to try to mock your smart components in Storybook. Instead, what I recommend doing is what I just said. Try to have as much as possible of your markup in the presentational components and have your container components be as thin as possible. That means that all of the UI, not the logic, but all of the UI you can actually put in Storybook. You can test it. You can show it to a designer. You can play around with it. You can try to change the colors if your component is supposed to be able. Maybe it's a component that has light and dark mode. You can test all of that from within Storybook, and I think next thing is I'm going to show you how you can do that in practice. So let's try to build a component together. Um, so let's just, in this case, we're just going to build something really simple. So let's try to make a button component. So I make a folder for the component, then I make a new file, button.js. Let's see if I have my, no, I don't have my snippets running. So export const button. And of course, I need to do all of the importing React and such. Cool. So this is a button, right? We need to think about what are the props that we want our button to have. We can just pass in props. But what I prefer to do is I actually prefer to destructure my props up here. So if I have props, imagine this is a button, right? So it probably has a label and it probably has something like a link. So let's say that we have a label and a link. That's our props, right? So down here now I could do like something like props.label, and then I expect that I get a label up there, right? Instead, I prefer to do like this. Label link. I hope it's just saying that they are unused. Yep, it's just complaining that they're unused, but we'll change that right away. So this component is actually just going to return some markup. So I'm going to make this a parenthesis instead, and then we can just start typing markup instead. So we use a button. This is not a React component. Notice it has a lowercase b. If it was capitalized, it was probably a React component, but it's lowercase, so this means it's just a plain old HTML element. So the button will have a label inside, and yeah, so so actually when I did link, that was maybe supposed to be like a ref, something like that. Since this is a button, I think I rather do like on click, and then the parent component will pass down on click, and then when you click on the button, it will trigger the onClick function, right? What's it complaining about now? Explicit type attribute for button. Button has type, yep. So, and if you don't currently have ESLint set up correctly in your browser, you're not going to get all of this. This is actually help, right? This is telling me whenever I'm creating a button, I should fill out the type of the button. In this case, it's just like a regular button. It's not a reset button. It's not a submit button. So, onClick is missing in props validation. Okay, yeah. So we actually have prop types set up. So that's why it's complaining. So that means that we're supposed to tell our component what is the type of the props that we're getting. I'm not sure I'm doing this entirely correctly, but I can go back to the documentation and reference if I'm not. It's been a while since I've been doing a lot of TypeScript, and you do it a little different there. So I think I need to import prop types from React, something like that. I think we have an example of it here. Prop types. Yes. So you're supposed to import prop types from prop types. Then you have your component here. And then down here, you do something like this. So I see I already did something wrong, didn't I? Yes, I did props there. Prop types. And then I need to import prop types here. And you can see now we're going to grab some types from prop types. Notice there's like something that can be a little bit of a pitfall here. So here, prop types is with lowercase p. That's because prop type is a attribute on your component. So here, prop types is with a capitalized P, and that's because prop types is a um, it's a data type that we are importing from this library called prop types. So that guy that we are importing here, that's just to be able to say this is a string, it's required, this is a number, it's required, and so on and so on, right? Whereas this one is whenever you have your component, it has like an attribute on it called prop types where you're supposed to put these guys in. So let's make sure that we get that right. So we have the capitalized one up here, prop types dot. So what the label, that's going to be a string, right? And we do require a label because if you have a button without a label, it doesn't look very good. Prop type dot string is required. I'm just wondering why it's not helping me, but maybe it's just because I'm in. Oh, maybe that's why. On click. So prop types dot function. I think I'm not going to make that one required. Oh, so when it's not required, okay, that's a good opportunity to show you how to do default props. So what it's saying is right now I did not make onClick required. But for the component to function, it should still have something on onClick. So that's why we can set a default type. And I don't know if we covered that here. And that's something else. React prop types defaults. Whoops, there's some typo. Type checking with React. Default prop value. So this should be it. So you have, similar to the prop types property on your component, and you have something called default props. And here you can just set your default props. So we can do button.default props. And then we can say that the onClick, if no other function has been declared, then we're just going to pass in a empty arrow function, something like this. Unexpected empty. So we actually set ESLint up so you can't do empty functions at all. I could ignore that, but actually maybe it's a good idea if the function is doing something by default. So maybe just do something like this. Now we're not allowed to use console.log. Yeah. I'm not sure which one is worse, but I guess so. There's like a little bit of a way to get out of this. So you can say ESLint disable next line, and then you can say no console, and then it will allow you to bend the rules a little bit on the next line. So generally it's nice to have the rule to not have console statements in your code, because that will catch any time that you're just putting something debugging in there and forget to remove it before you commit your code. We generally don't want to commit console log statements. It's fine if you're just using it for debugging, but remove them before you commit. Oh, it's still Complaining here. Type of declared in prop type function. That's correct. Huh. React no typos. Prop types. Maybe it's called something else when you have a function. Prop types dot func. That's why. Cool. So this is our function now. This is just a complete, very, very simple button component. Now I want to try and test that button. And what most people are going to do to test that when they're starting out building React applications is probably that they're going to go somewhere like, I don't know, maybe not directly in the app. Where could we go? In the home component, maybe? Final project section, something like that. Then we might put like a div around a section here. And then we might go here, and then we might take our button components and say label is hello. We don't actually need to put a function in there. Now it's complaining that it doesn't know button. That's fine because we haven't imported it. Import button from, and we want to grab it from, I think we need to step out because we're inside home containers, home. Where is our button folder? Oh, it's because we're in containers, we're not in components, which is correct. So we need to step out twice. And then into components. And then we can go into the buttons folder. And then we want to grab the button file. Yeah, so this should allow me to npm run dev, right? To run the project. I guess I should have tested this before. So home should be here. I'm not sure why that's happening. Let's see here. Check the render method of home. Okay, so it looks like something is. Check the render method of home. Create create child. Kind of looks like I'm passing in the wrong prop. Let's just real quick try to remove our button again and then check that the page starts working. The page does start to work. So something wrong here. Button, label, on click. I mean, we can try to pass in a on click. Div created by home, app, browser router, So it says it's expecting a string or class function got undefined. Oh, forgot to export your component from its file it's defined in. I am exporting button. Am I importing it wrong? Yeah, that's why. Cool. So now we have the hello button here. And if we click the hello button, you can see it says hello. That's because we set the console log here. We should actually be able to remove that one now. Button clicked. That's fine. Okay, so the point is now we actually tested that this component works, but we kind of had to break the UI. We had to break the app a little bit. So what we did is we went in here to the home components and we just like put a div in here and stuff like that in order to just test this guy here. It's not even supposed to be there. Maybe the component where we are using our button is not built yet. So what are we going to do about that? I mean, of course, we can leave the button folder here in the project and then we can commit that and then we can remove the code here. But in the process of adding in some code here and then removing it after and stuff like that, we might actually have made a little mistake here. Maybe we, I don't know, maybe that I don't know what I'm typing. Maybe I just like made a little bit of a typo in the process of removing something. At least I went into this file here and changed something just to test something, and we want to avoid that. We don't want to start putting something into files then in order to remove it later. At least we don't want to do that with files that are part of the actual website. So that's why we have Storybook. That's something where you can go and you can experiment. It's a free for all. You can just put anything in Storybook. So let's look into that. So I'm just gonna remove the data here and I'm gonna remove that line. So now we should be back to what it was. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make a story, new file, button dot, is it story or stories? I can't even remember. I saw one of them had a story here, stories. Probably best if I show you the documentation to do this. So, of course, you can always study the documentation on Storybook. I recommend doing that. But we have like a little more of a succinct version of that here. So using Storybook. So this explains how to run Storybook. And here we have how to create a new story. So we can just basically grab the code here. And you can see here is the naming convention, the name of your component .stories.js, and then Storybook will automatically pick up that file. So I copied the code from there. Now we're importing React, and then we want to import our component. So our component in this case is button, and we are in the same folder as that. So we can just replace this. I did not actually call my button.component the way it's supposed to be, but I guess we can live with that. Then I'm going to replace that right there. And now I can do the stuff that you saw before. So we do label, make buttons great again. And we don't have an on-click. So this one is just called basic story. We can give it a new name here. And we can give it a title up here. So we should probably call it. Actually, let's just see what comes out in Storybook before we start changing that. So notice right now I'm running the server npm run dev to like run the application to see what the application looks like. But I don't want to see this component in the application because the component I'm building right now is not ready to be put in the application. The component that's using this component is not built right now. So I don't want to see anything of that in the application. So I can actually just like stop the npm run dev. And instead, I'm going to run npm run storybook. You can run them alongside if you want. I don't know what these warnings are about. Cool. So you can see this started Storybook on localhost 3007. You can also access it on your network if you want, but just go to localhost 3007 to see Storybook. Oh, there's some sort of Expected a string for built-in component but got undefined. That looks like the error that we had before, isn't it? May have mixed. Oh, I think I made the same mistake that I did before. I did. Yep. Make buttons great again. Lovely. And we can actually make. Let me see. So you can see this is actually the heading up here, some title, right? So we can use this one and we can call it buttons, and then we can use that heading to show all of the buttons that we want to have in our application. So buttons are a tremendous joy. And then we can try to extend this one. We want to check that we can pass in our own props. So console log this is tremendous. Okay, so there's something breaking here. Oh, that's because we are exporting the same. So actually this name here, the name of this variable here will translate into the name here. So you can say you can figure out how to title case it and all that. So if I press this one, I can open the console. You can see it says this is tremendous, and it does it multiple times if I want. And this one is just using the default action where we said button clicked. So that means right now we have our button inside of Storybook. And if you take all of your dumb components, not your smart components, but if you take all of your dumb components, and every time you write a dumb component, you make a story for it in Storybook. That means several things. For one, it means that we're not going to have a lot of hard-coded test code inside of the application that someone has to find later and remove. We're only going to have code that we have committed to. This is part of the application, right? All of the testing stuff, the stuff where we don't know exactly how it's going to work, or if you just want to demonstrate that you can use this component in many ways. You can use it like this, you can use it like this, you can use it like this. That stuff goes in Storybook. That's our playground. That's where you can play around. And if you do it like this, then you can have all of this where you can show how to use your component. You can even make README files for your components if you want to explain to your co-students how to use your component. And you can do tons of stuff inside of Storybook, but it will not affect the real application. And that also means that other students can go to Storybook and then they can discover components. And that's really important if you ask me, because whenever I sit down and I try to come up with a component that I need in order to solve a problem, I want to know what other components are already out there. Did someone build something that's similar to what I'm building right now? Something that I can reuse, something that I can leverage. So if you put everything in Storybook, that makes it so much easier for your fellow students to figure out what do we have? What components do we already have? What can I extend? And that just gives you a much better premise for building a project where you're actually reusing code. And another reason this is really great is as well is that whenever you have something, whenever you try to implement a design given by a designer, then you can show the designer your design in Storybook before you start tearing apart the application in order to get your design into the application, because maybe the designer is going to tell you, oh, that was not what I wanted. It's completely misunderstood. And I tried this so many times in my professional career that I build something, I get some screenshots from a designer, and it's usually not my fault. At least that's what I'm telling myself. Usually they just like didn't think it through. They made like a really quick sketch and they were like imagining that I would come and ask them if there was any problems. And I just understand, oh, that's pretty clear. I'm just going to build that. And then I build it. And then I finish it up and I'm going home for the weekend, and then they see the feature and then, oh, that's not what I wanted. And it's probably just because we weren't really communicating well enough. With something like Storybook, we have like this place where we put things in, and then we can use that to actually communicate in terms of something real. We're not just looking at a drawing. We're not just like sitting in a meeting trying to discuss something verbally, where everyone has their own picture in their mind of how things are going to work. Everyone is thinking that they have the same picture in their mind, but in reality, everyone have different pictures of how things are going to work. So I think Storybook is a really, really great tool for aligning the team. It's really great for focusing the UI. It's really great for discussing the UI. It's really, really great for experimenting. So please make sure to take all of your DOM components, all of the components that are easy to put in Storybook, all of the components that don't require a database backend, an API, or anything like that, all of the components that don't have side effects. Take those components, put them in Storybook, and if you think it's relevant, you can make multiple versions of the components, so you can show others how you could potentially use this. And of course, again, make sure to go to the README file and read through the section here, because there's a lot of good information on what you need to think about when you're building components. There's a lot of stuff here I haven't covered. There's something about theming here. Um, um, yeah. So that's what I had to say about the components and about Storybook. So I hope that will help you a lot. Take care.